Thank you, John. And I have to say, Dead Poets Society is, along with High Noon, up there in my favourite films of all time. If I'd known you were going to use that clip, I would probably totally have changed my approach, because the approach I'm going to use, if it's all right with you folks, is to tell you a story which will bring to life some of what I want to talk about. And that will take up, is it okay if this takes up about the first 10 to 15 minutes, John? And then we can progress from there. Does that work for you? Fabulous. Wonderful. Thank you. So that is me. Who is Tom Bell? I guess, which is a question some of you may be asking. That's a short description of myself. I'll just let you digest what is in there. Some of you may be looking at that first sentence in blue, willful blindness expert. What does that mean? Well, we're going to come to that as we go through this. And how this fits up with speaking up safely. You will find there's an absolute join up here in terms of, I'm going to make the point that for people to be able to speak up safely, they not only have to exist and work in cultures that facilitate that, but they have to be able to see what's happening. And you're going to find this area, I think, fascinating. We're going to delve a little bit into the behavioural sciences, which I hope you'll find interesting. So let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, there was a homeless teenager with a juvenile criminal record who had been kicked out of school. He was saved by the kindness of strangers, one of whom became his wife. He was pulled up by the bootstraps and became a confident, hard-working, shiny-shoed, shirt, tie and suit-wearing, MBA sporting, respected and knowledgeable chap with more letters after his surname than he had before it. And bear in mind, his parents had given him 2 middle names because their families hadn't been able to agree on what he should be called. He served as a school governor for 8 years, successfully chaired his local carers organisation for 5 years, sat on the local steering group of Common Purpose and on the board of the Northern Leadership Academy. Amongst those he worked with and managed, he was known as that tall, thoughtful, proactive bloke, mildly obsessed with mountain biking and music festivals, who saw the best in everyone and wanted everyone to succeed, and who played with an open hand. After joining the NHS in January 2012, his boss called him the most enthusiastic, positive person she had ever known. Each day, he would encourage those around him to be the best they could be, and saw whatever challenges were thrown at him and his colleagues as opportunities for improvement. It's fair to say he could be positive to the point of being annoying. Nobody's perfect. He thought he had a bright future ahead of him and felt he had found his place in the world. If, as John Ruskin rightly observed, there is no wealth but life, then he saw working in the world of health and care as a privilege and an opportunity, and he threw himself into it wholeheartedly. He was told by one GP in a rural practice that he was the most helpful person he had ever come across in the NHS, and he was told by a member of his team who left for bigger and better things that he was the best manager he had ever had. Then one day, after a couple of years working in the NHS, he saw an important decision being made that he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Being a positive, trusting sort of person, he thought this decision must be an oversight on the part of people who are considering it. Nobody with half an ounce of common sense or a conscience would make this decision if they were aware of the possible implications. He was very trusting and a touch naive, and so he put his hand in the air and said to all the directors and governors of the NHS trust he was working in, "I think this is a bad decision that could lead to services becoming less safe for patients," and then he explained why. When he did this, he had thought he was in a psychologically safe space in which tough conversations could be had, and he framed his observations in a simple, direct way. He felt his observations were valid, and he thought that focusing on the potential impact of their decision on patients would get the attention of the board in a positive way. And on realising the mistake they were clearly about to make, they would reverse their decision. Did I say he was just a touch naive? But they didn't. So he thought it must be a communication problem of his own making, and he decided to prepare and submit a carefully drafted rationale to his director, outlining the potential pitfalls of the decision being made, the political as well as the practical pitfalls. I said he was naive, not entirely daft. But his director suddenly seemed preoccupied with other things. There was never time for meaningful conversation. So being mildly persistent as well as mildly annoying, He shared the rationale he had written with the chairman, the chief executive, the board, including the non-executive directors, and some of the more intelligent governors. Though in fairness to the governors, these could be counted on less than half a hand, a two-fingered sloth's hand. But still he had no response, so he reluctantly decided the only responsible option left open to him was to contact the Care Quality Commission. He told his director what he was doing. Have I used the word naive yet? After all, he thought, I'm known for playing with an open hand. What have I to fear from speaking my truths? If the problem is my communication skills or my lack of understanding of the situation, then maybe the CQC's involvement can shed some light on matters. Surely that will be in everyone's interests, won't it? Unknown to him, what he had done was make something called a protected disclosure. He had inadvertently stuck his head way above the parapet and become a whistleblower without really knowing it, and certainly without wanting to become one, and without a clue about the many tons of shit he was about to bring down on his own head. He had always thought whistleblowers were troublemakers, troublesome creatures, sensationalists who tried to make mountains out of molehills and who couldn't see the bigger picture. You know the ones, negative types who weren't team players. But then, after he did this, the once confident, conscientious, positive and able man who had immersed himself in his work and taken great pride in doing it well, started to notice that the sense of purpose and engagement he had previously felt was slowly but surely and systematically being stripped away. He found himself excluded from the team's social activity. It looked like they were all having a lovely time on social media. His abilities and skills were questioned by his manager. He was given meaningless menial tasks. He was asked to cover an absent colleague's role. Then another, and another, and another, until at one point he found himself covering the work of 5 people. And then one day in front of his colleagues, during a full team meeting, he broke down in tears. Even though his own sister had taken her own life after being abused in the care of an NHS hospital, he now found himself apologising for his views, his conscience, and who he was. That evening he went home to his wife Debbie and sobbed uncontrollably and inconsolably at the foot of the stairs. The confidence and positivity he once felt had deserted him, and he was left wondering if he was the problem. Perhaps he had misjudged the situation. Maybe he had been wrong all along. He still recalls that day as one of the lowest points in his life. Finally, when he could take no more, he went to see a doctor and took time off with stress and depression. He had never wanted to, but he knew he couldn't carry on as he was. He also sought the help of a psychologist, without whom he may never have resurfaced. In March 2017, over 2 years after blowing the whistle and after a protracted, energy-sapping battle that took his mind to the dark places nobody's mind should visit, he was forced from his employment in the NHS on the grounds of his mental health. The same culture of willful blindness that had enabled his sister to be abused by an older mental health nurse, subjecting her to a crisis pregnancy and then an abortion over 20 years previously, was now toying with his mental health and pushing him to the brink. It's taken him almost 5 years to become the person he is today. He has changed. He has experienced all the rage and despair you can ever imagine. But with the help of many people, he has reached a point where he knows beyond certainty that changing the cultures of willful blindness that prevail in too many health and care organisations will only begin when we start to understand and address the causes that underpin them. Anger has its rightful place. It can be a great catalyst for action. But if lasting improvement begins with understanding, anger is not a place that welcomes understanding. He wrote a book in 2020. It was the best, most cathartic therapy he has ever done. And the he, of course, is me. And putting my truths down and speaking my truths unabridged, although it took me ages to do, was just the best. I reached the end of that process and I suddenly realized I'm the sane one in a crazy world. That might sound like an incredibly bold statement, but there is this point that you reach where you've been pushed down and beaten down so hard but you do start to believe that it's you. So I decided to take my experiences, the lived, the learned, and the professional knowledge, and I set up Cormetis Consulting to try and make a positive difference. And I've made links and been working with and establishing partnerships with other complementary organisations, including the IHSCM, other services, and of course, people. The root of the word courage is the Latin word cor, and some of you may know this already. And the reason I came up with this name, as well as Cormetis being a new word, which meant I could get the website domain for it, which is always a bonus. The root of the word is courage, which originally meant to speak one's mind by telling all one's heart. And I know from experience that in certain cultures, that is an incredibly big ask of people to do. And Metis was the Titan goddess of good counsel, planning, custom, cunning, and wisdom. Maybe that's a new word, custom. You might ask if cunning has a place in the improvement of health and care services. And my simple answer to you is that if the crooks know all the tricks, then honest people must learn them in self-defense. Being honest and displaying integrity doesn't have to mean being naive and exposing yourself or your loved ones or your family to unnecessary or avoidable risk. So these are some of the things I've been involved with over the last couple of years. I contributed to the review of the Fit and Proper Persons test, which was led by Tom Kark QC. Recently contributed to a UK National Action Plan for Open Government. I spoke at last year's Patient Safety Congress, and I'll be speaking again with Leeds Teaching Hospitals Trust at this year's. And I contributed to a report called When Things Go Wrong, which was an influential report written by an organisation called Justice, who campaign for a better justice system in the UK. So speaking up, what I'm going to do before I go into this slide is I'm going to pause very briefly and ask if anyone has any questions up to this point, any thoughts, any observations. Please, Victoria.
Yeah, my question is how can we ensure psychological safety in the workplace? Should we be looking at developing guidelines, policies around that? So when our psychological safety is compromised at work, people can be held accountable for that.
What a great question. If I just whip you back very briefly to a slide, Victoria. So the top left bit, which is the review of the Fit and Proper Persons test. Yeah, this is the thing that was led by Tom Kark QC. There's a wonderful phrase, and I'm going to get it wrong because I'm trying to remember it off pat, which is, it says that, when mores are not enough, laws won't work, yeah? And when mores are satisfactory, laws are unnecessary. The point being made is that you can legislate, and we've had tons of legislation over the years, haven't we? We've had enough legislation to pave the M6. The problem is it doesn't work, because we talk about culture change. What we actually mean is behaviour change, people, and that starts with people. I think it's quite disempowering, actually, to talk about organisational culture change without talking about personal change, people change, yeah? Because the point you're making is absolutely valid. If somebody comes forward with a set of values and a policy, which, by the way, every company that's got itself into trouble by not letting people speak up over the last number of years, so that includes Oxfam, the Co-op Bank, it includes Enron, of course, it includes recently VW, and more recently, the Telford and Shrewsbury Hospitals Trust. They all had good policies, yeah. If somebody said, have you got a policy for this? They'd go, yeah, of course we have. That's great. Yeah, cool. People, oh, yes, God, people can speak up. Yes, we welcome that. We want good management practice. But it's what's lived, isn't it, that's important. It's what we see lived around us. And the thing that the reason I highlight the Fit and Proper Persons test was that after 5 years of that being implemented, and that, by the way, the reason I contributed to that was the reason I had to whistleblow, was that the way that was not implemented in the trust that I worked for meant that I had significant concerns about them going forward. But that legislation doesn't work because it kind of tends to come down from top down, doesn't it? So, Robert Francis writes his report after mid-staffs, and then this recommendation for a Fit and Proper Persons test comes out, and it's classic government knee-jerk reaction. Right, we need some guidelines. But what we've done is actually created a system where the people who succeed in the system, and this is not a criticism, I stress, by the way, we're going to come on to this very shortly, but this is an observation of behaviour. They behave in ways that they've learned, they've acquired those behaviours, and those are the behaviours they need to survive and thrive in the system that they're in. So what we've got is a lot of good people and a lot of bad systems. We have very few bad people. Of course, we'll always have people that do bad things. That's life. We have a crime statistic rate. If you if you took the public services as a whole, even just the health and care sector with, you know, approximately 2 million people within it, and you put them into a city of, let's call it a city of 2 million, you could apply some crime stats, which I think would equate to about 20 odd murders a year happening in that, about 2,000 crimes every week being reported. So we're not, people working in health and care are not perfect. We're merely a mirror of society. So bad things are always going to happen. But when we try and legislate from a top-down perspective, it simply doesn't work, because the people that have learned how to thrive and survive in that system know how to play the game. And the game is not one of compliance with the intent. The game is one of demonstrating compliance with the intent. And those are two very different things. Does that help answer your question or not?
Yeah, absolutely.
And more than happy as well, by the way, to take any questions after this and to engage with people offline as we move on. But how do you create a psychologically safe space? And it's the first thing is, there's no quick fix here, folks. You know, when people, if you've ever been in one of those meetings where people talk about things, don't they, like scale and pace. I mean, I just burst out laughing when I hear that in meetings now, because it just sounds too much like hail and pace. And for those of a certain generation, there's a sort of comedy element to that. And then when people talk about quick wins, let's get some quick wins. Well, I think the first quick win we should all have in healthcare is, let's abolish the phrase quick wins, because there aren't any. We are where we are today because of decisions made previously. And the sooner we understand that and start to get to grips with the fact that improvement only begins with understanding how we got where we are now, rather than constantly saying, right, let's forget how we got here, let's just move on, let's just move on. There's far too much of that going on in health and care services. We've got to take that time to sit back and say, how did we reach this point where the cultures in many of our organizations are broken to the point where some people can't even speak out about how broken those cultures are. And there are reasons why people don't speak up. And one, of course, is fear. And you touched upon that psychological safety there, Victoria. Another big one, of course, is futility. That actually there's this sense that, well, if I do speak up, nothing's going to change anyway. So why do it? Why put my head above the parapet if nothing happens? Because they've already got a nice set of values. I mean, every organization has a lovely set of values, doesn't it? But, you know, I was talking to a group of students in the States a couple of weeks ago about the values of the Minneapolis Police Department. Yeah. Now, we all know, we think we know what happened with George Floyd and with Derek Chauvin, yeah, and we see what happened. That was the lived values. That what we saw there was the lived values, not the values on the paper, and the two things are completely different. And so the two rookie cops that were present at that murder, they were taking their behavioural cues from the two experienced policemen. They weren't looking at, you know, I think his name's Chief Arredondo. You know, he had a lovely vision and values statement, but they didn't have that in their top pockets. Nobody was saying to Derek Chauvin, I think you should probably stop that about, because I'm looking at these values, Derek, and it said we should treat people with respect and integrity. And it doesn't appear that you're doing that. Do you know what I mean? It's easy to write things down on paper. It's incredibly difficult to live them. But willful blindness, I'm going to tell you a little bit about willful blindness now and why it's so important in relation to speaking up. Some of you will have come across the phrase willful blindness. Some of you might call it other things. It does have a legal definition in the States. We're not going to get into that now, if that's okay. I find it really useful though as an umbrella term, because for me, I think if you use it as an umbrella term, it helps to cover a whole lot of things. So if you look at every instance of whether you want to call it tragedy or scandal, so whether it happened in the finance sector, the voluntary sector such as Oxfam, the manufacturing sector such as VW, or the health and care sector, you know, whether it's Winterbourne, whether it's Gosport, willful blindness lies at the heart of that. And willful blindness is actually a coping mechanism. So I use phrases such as target obsession disorder, which causes people, it's a bit like people putting on blinkers, you know, on a race horse. They just go forward, everything else is excluded. And when we focus too much on one thing, we exclude everything else to the detriment of the bigger picture, if you like. I cover a lot of these phrases are covered within the short masterclass that I've done along with in partnership with John and Jade and Michaela, for whose help I have to say I'm very grateful. But I'm going to take you back to the origins, if I may, of willful blindness. Quick question of those folks that are there. Does anybody recognize this landscape? The landscape then is, the picture was taken from a trip that my wife and I took many years ago to a place called Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. And you might be asking, what's this got to do with anything? But Olduvai Gorge is sometimes referred to as the cradle of civilization, and the importance of what was discovered there cannot be overstated in terms of its role in helping us to understand what drives us, yeah? And one of the things that they discovered at Boulder Gorge was that that's the place we started to collaborate. We started to work together and make tools. And so the history of our species, and I please, I don't wish to offend anyone that doesn't believe in evolution, genuinely. So these are, I'll be careful here. But the history of evolution, which is, okay, let's stop digging a hole for myself, Tom, is that we gradually learn these behaviors. And when you see how much more successful it was to hunt in groups and to collaborate, then actually that's Boulder Gorge shows the first signs of that collaboration and of that working together. And that's the thing that took us as a species from where we were to where we are today. We are hardwired. Some of what is in us is hardwired into us, because once it was realized that working collaboratively and in a group led to better survival rates and a better chance of life, then being ostracized from the group was essentially a death sentence by either starvation or predation. These things are hardwired into us. So when we see things happening around us, we actually use willful blindness as a coping mechanism. If we see something untoward happening, which if we feel acknowledging we would need to address, then the way we do, we turn we hear the phrase blind eyes and deaf ears. If we turn a blind eye or a deaf ear to those things, that helps us cope with them. Because actually we know that if we're going to raise our head above the parapet and talk about those things, then we're going to be exposed to harm. We're going to be ostracized from the group. And if we are dependent on that group for our lifestyle, for our status, for our income, to support what we have, our family, our loved ones, there's a lot at stake here. In modern society, let's not underestimate what's at stake if you lose your job and your career. It is massive. We might not suffer predation or starvation, but we're certainly going to get excluded, and that is a huge thing. So our need to belong is hardwired into us, and willful blindness is one of the mechanisms we use to cope with that. And it's one of the mechanisms that was used in the hospital where my sister was abused. And if you look through, as I say, every case study of whether you call it a tragedy or a scandal, willful blindness lies at the root of it. Now, speaking up is one of the key. If willful blindness is the disease, so to speak, then speaking up is one of the cures. The problem is speaking up is far easier said than done, isn't it? Because first of all, we have to acknowledge what's going on around us. This is a slide that I used last year at the Health Service Patient Safety Congress. And there's something in here I think quite liberating about realizing this. And again, I don't wish to offend anyone that doesn't believe in evolution. I think once we acknowledge our origins, start to understand that it's the complexity of our makeup, not our simplicity, that's the problem. And someone once said to me, Tom, if the human brain was simple enough to understand it, we would be too simple to understand it. And I think there's a great deal of truth in that. So what drives a lot of our behavior, our responses and our actions isn't actually within our control. Now that might sound like a sweeping statement, but we respond incredibly quickly to a lot of things without knowing why we're doing it. And as I say, our need to belong is incredibly strong. When we talk about the need to speak up, it's not just finding our voice, is it, that we're talking about here. What we're saying is, how do we do that safely in a way that is safe for us and those we love and those around us and those who depend upon us? But also when I talk about moving from speaking up to standing out, which I do in the masterclass that I've created, it's a matter of personal choice. That isn't a solution, I appreciate. If you're looking for a fix here, there isn't one. As I say, there are no quick fixes here. It is culturally and contextually specific. Whether or not you feel safe to speak up and put your head above the parapet is very much a judgment call on your part, because you will know the organization you work for. And the thing I hoped that I tried to get across from the story that I told, and the reason I told you the story in that way, was that I made a lot of misjudgments. I made a lot of assumptions about the culture. I actually believed the value statement. I don't wish to sound like a cynic, but when the organization said it would welcome people who spoke up, I took it at its word. And I then realized that actually that was incorrect. So I totally misjudged the culture. I misjudged my position. I made myself vulnerable and essentially sacrificed what could have been a good career because I spoke my truths. Would I have spoken them differently if I'd known? Possibly. Would they still have got me into trouble? I think in the culture of the organization I was in, the answer to that is a yes. I don't think there was an easy way of me dealing with those things. And having the history that I have in my family regarding what happened to my sister Alison, I don't think that was a comfortable place for me to be. So I think leaving that particular NHS trust was probably a very positive thing for me and for my mental health and my well-being. And I think as a result of that, I found my worthy challenge. So I've taken those lemons, if you like, and I'm now trying to make lemonade. I'm going to stop blethering. I've thrown a lot at you there, I appreciate. That is me, easily findable on LinkedIn, on the web, on Twitter, and numbers and emails are there. At this point, if I may, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Sorry about blistering through that. Slightly conscious of time, not too polished at presenting, so forgive me, but hopefully that was useful.
Tom, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. I've heard it a couple of times now, but it's still powerful, powerful, powerful stuff. Would anybody like to ask Tom any questions, perhaps? We've got a few minutes before the next session. Do feel free to put your hand up or just unmute and ask away.
Yeah, so I'm very passionate about psychological safety, and I do a lot of speaking up in the workplace. I kind of resonate with some of the things you've said, but I have been quite persistent in doing this constructively, and I will continue to do so, because sometimes we need to look at our, when decisions have been made and the impact it can have on our patients and on our staff, and we should be able to constructively, provide this feedback without fear of reprisal, without and also, but not only to, but also to bring forth your ideas, your projects, in a safe space. And so I would encourage everybody, we need to keep going. We need to keep that training. I think lots of training change behaviors and have this organizational culture where we can safely speak up. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you, Victoria. Tom, could I need to ask the million-dollar question, really. Do you think that the NHS and social care is in a better place now than it was 5 or 10 years ago? Are we making any kind of progress towards a better approach to people who speak up?
What a question. Again, the answer is, this is not a cop-out, so and press me if I don't give you what you need here. Everything is contextually specific. So I think there will be some parts of the system that have progressed. Now, the difficulty here is that I think, as you know, Brits, we love to end on a positive, don't we? Things are getting better. And there's something here, isn't there, about, let me bring this to life for you, John. So if you look at what happened with my sister, so she's taken advantage of, an older male nurse has unprotected sex on the hospital premises with her, grooms her when she was an inpatient. There is a crisis pregnancy that happens as a result of what's been allowed to go on. And then the termination is arranged, the pregnancy termination is arranged, which was then kept off the records, so that when Alison was handed over to mental health services in another part of the country, South Yorkshire, they were blissfully unaware of what had gone on. And Alison was deeply religious, and so the shame factor was played into, and she didn't say anything to anyone other than my mum. My mum was the only person she confided in before she died. Now, there were people with subsequent investigations have found out that there were people who knew. But what the positive in this is that there was actually a nurse who wrote a letter, who knew what was going on and wrote a letter to the hospital's management. The negative is that she was then ostracized by her colleagues. The other negatives are that, and I'm loath to use the word positives and negatives because they just kind of are, aren't they? I think when we start labeling things, that becomes, it makes them a bit more difficult. But you're asking the question, are things better or worse? I actually believe, my experience is that I think people's consciousness of these things is better. I think we have higher ethical standards as, can I call this as a country? Now, some people may argue that, I get that, but I think, let me bring this to life. I know from speaking to somebody there that, and this will horrify some of you listening, having sex with mental health inpatients was viewed by some, not all I stress, was viewed by some of the nurses as a perk of the job. That's the state it was in. Now, I'm asking you to remember this was an isolated rural trust on the northern edge of England's border, yeah? And issues of safeguarding, I think, are always amplified in rural isolated areas where there is not that exchange of staff. Those people are in post for a long time, and there's a lot to lose if you speak up. In other words, you can't speak up in that trust and then walk into a job with another one next door. If you speak up in that trust, you're out. That's your livelihood gone. You've got to move out the area, yeah? So there are lots of factors that amplify it in rural areas. So would anyone now working in health and social care think that having sex with patients was a legitimate perk of the job? I think the answer to that is a no. That might just be me telling myself that, but I think the answer is a no. I think nobody would say over a pint in the pub, would they? This, what a great perk of the job this is. Yeah, sorry to sound flippant, but it wouldn't happen. I just don't see it happening. Have we regulated now to the point where we've encouraged people to hide their mistakes more? Yes. We've encouraged people to hide their mistakes and in some respects their humanity. This may surprise some of you, and I'm not looking for any pats on the back when I say this. When we eventually found out, the guy in 2017 finally admitted under caution to the police what he had done. After nearly 30 years, he finally admitted to the police. He committed his offences in 1988. We wanted restorative justice. We didn't want, don't get me wrong, I've had all those fantasies that you might expect about meeting this chap down a dark alley with a piece of 4x2 in my hand. But that's not how society can work, is it? That's not going to take us forward, yeah? We wanted restorative justice. I wanted a conversation. As it happened, the CPS decided the case wasn't in the public interest to prosecute. That's another story. But we wanted restorative justice.
Yes, sorry, I'm just conscious of time, Tom. We're going to have to bring this back. So I mean, my view.
Yeah. The question is,
if you want to quickly wrap it up, then
sure. So the question is, I think we've regulated now to the point where we are encouraging people to hide their mistakes, and we have less room for humanity. But I think our standards, if you want to call them that, our ethical standards as a nation and our attitude towards people, vulnerable people in care, whether they are in social care or in mental health or acute or community hospital settings, I think that has improved.
Thank you. Well,
fair answer?
It's yeah, no, fair answer. Very fair answer. My view, I'm in a very privileged position. I get to talk to people independent of the NHS. Our members write to me with all sorts of stuff, and it is clear to me that whistleblowing is still a terrible path for people to have to go down, and the consequences for people still today in 2022 are frightful. And I fear that you're right in terms of the regulatory environment we have set through the CQC and others just encourages people who are doing a poor job to hide it, and that is not by any measure a helpful and healthy place for us to be in. But where we go from here, I have all sorts of ideas which we unfortunately don't have time to share today. Perhaps, Tom, you and I ought to have a power hour session where we talk to our members about where do we go from here. That might be an interesting place for us to go to.
I would welcome that, because there are lots of suggestions in the masterclass, because I've tried to bring it to practical ideas people can take forward. Yeah,
we'll do that for sure. All right, well, look, we have to leave it there for today. Can we just give our big applause to Tom? He's a brave man, he's a principled man, and I think you're a man of great integrity as well, Tom. So thank you very much indeed for all that you've done, and thank you also for your fabulous work with the masterclass. I've seen some clips already. I'm much looking forward to making that available to our members. All right.
Can I very briefly thank yourself, Michaela and Jade and the team there for making this possible and making this happen?
Absolutely our pleasure. Absolutely our pleasure.